We agree the business as circulated on the agenda. Agreed by parliamentarians present. Agreed. Thank you very much indeed. That enables us to commence work on the all-party parliamentary group's open session today. I'd like to say a big welcome to the first speaker, Helen, who's the Shadow Minister for Early Years. It's been heartening as a new member of Parliament with a history in the world of local authority, early years education, children's safeguarding, and as a father of two very young children who've seen the benefits that really good early years education can make great directly, to discover that there are quite a lot of parliamentarians who have a real interest in this area and who recognise across all the different parties its importance. I'm scheduled to make some introductory remarks, but I think given timing, I'm going to keep those extremely brief and just highlight a particular issue which I think it's really important in Parliament we try and address. And that is that when we look at the way in which the Department of Education allocates resources, whilst we know that the money that is spent on the early years brings about the biggest difference, has the best positive impact on a child's life, the bulk of the money that we spend on them is when they're towards the end of secondary. And the need to use evidence about what has impact and focus the resources accordingly is an area where clearly the government has some catching up to do. And that's not a criticism of the present government. It's an issue that's persisted for many, many years because the voice of secondary education at the schools forums where funding formulas are determined, the voice of secondary schools and particularly head teachers of big academy chains in the DfE is a very, very loud voice indeed. And the voice of the earlier sector can be fragmented. But one of the positives which I think we should take some part in is that people like Leon Feinstein, who I first encountered at the Early Intervention Foundation, who's a real research and statistics guru, is now over with the Children's Commission and has been making the point to government that you can see a clear correlation between the child's early years foundation stage results and how they go on to do in their A-levels. And that's a really powerful demonstration. The predictors are that clear that what the early years do makes a lifelong difference to the outcomes for children. And that's the discussion and the debate that's going to take place today. So we have a whole series of different speakers, starting with Helen, the Shadow Minister. We're going to hear from people who are practitioners in the sector about what they're seeing going on and what their reflections are on the issues around policy development. And then later on, and I won't be able to chair this because I will have had to step away by that stage, but there'll be an opportunity for some Q&A for people in the room to raise their thoughts, share some experience, in order to feed into the work of your party parliamentary group to take this agenda. So with those very brief remarks, I'd like to invite Hayes, Shadow Minister, to speak.
Thank you, David. Where's the best place to stand?
I would suggest sort of standing there and directing your remarks towards the. It seems odd, but it's just that.
Yeah, absolutely fine. So good afternoon, everyone. Really good to be here today and to see all of you. And thanks especially to parliamentarians who've got to make us for it this afternoon. Margaret in particular, actually in the last minute. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to meet with the APPG today, and I would say thank you to all of you in the room and online as well for the work that you do with mostly very young children, I think, to try to give them all the best possible start in life and to champion early years education and the vital role that it plays here in Parliament. I'm really excited to have been appointed to the role of Shadow Minister for Children and Early Years. I was appointed in December, so just over 6 months or so into this role, and I spent a really busy 6 months meeting with all sorts of the most inspiring people and organisations who work with children in different parts of the country, and it's been an absolute privilege. I think this is the best job in the House of Commons, second only to being the actual Minister for Children and Early Years, which would be, even better. Giving every child the best possible start in life should be a fundamental core goal of any government, but it doesn't happen by accident. We can all say how important we think children are and how much we love our own children and how much we value the experiences that are offered to our children, but it takes political will to see every policy decision through the lens of its impact on our youngest precious members of society, and to put them at the centre of decision making. How children are looked after is fundamental to family life, it's fundamental to our economy, and it's fundamental to creating a fairer, more equal society. And that is the role, those three things that the early years sector plays and should be supported to do. For younger children, what is childcare for parents, enabling us to go out to work, to support our families, to contribute to the economy, is early years education for children, which supports child development, gets them ready for school, and helps to address disadvantage. And as I know all too well as a parent of two teenage daughters, the challenge of childcare doesn't stop at the age of 5. In fact, in many ways, it gets more complicated, and it continues to be just about as expensive. I mean, I've got two, of necessity, extremely independent young women in my home, and we still patch together. You know, they've got two parents who work pretty long hours, and we're still patching together every single week who's going to be there for them in those crucial hours between 4:30 or so and 7, 8 o'clock in the evening, and sometimes a bit later. All children should be able to access a breakfast club with a nutritious meal to prepare them for the school day and help them to learn as well as they can, and enriching, stimulating activities after school so that they can discover their passion, develop new skills, relax with their friends, and sustain good mental well-being. As we look across the country, the cost of childcare is a major contributor to the cost of living crisis for families with children. The cost of a full-time nursery place for a child under 2 has risen by approximately £1,500 over the past 5 years. The cost of after-school care has risen faster than wages, with many parents spending more on after-school clubs than on the weekly food shop, and almost 2/3 of parents spending as much or more on childcare than on their rent or their mortgage. And something else is broken too, because where there are subsidies for 2-year-old places and for 3- and 4-year-old places, and I know very well, talking to this audience, we don't talk about free places because they're not free to everybody. The take-up of that subsidy is pitifully low, and across the country at the same time, more and more nurseries are closing because they can't make the financial model work and keep on paying the bills and paying their staff as well. We also know that the pandemic has been devastating for children, and the evidence coming from schools now about the school readiness of children who have experienced the first years of their life during that time of restrictions on things like speech and language and mental well-being and socialisation, and all of those things we know is really troubling, and there is an urgent need for more support there. As the Labour Party, we have a mission to give every child the best start in life. We're really proud of our record in government when we did put children absolutely front and centre of our policy programme, and we delivered Sure Start and vast improvements in early years education across the country. And we would do so again. We set out our immediate plans in our Children's Recovery Plan for a 4-fold increase in the pupil premium for nursery age children. It's a really substantial immediate investment in the early years sector. Breakfast clubs for school age children and after school enrichment clubs for every child. We'll set out in the coming months our plans for a much more fundamental reform of the system for early years education and childcare. And we want to work with parents, we want to work with trade unions, and we want to work with providers to expand the availability of high quality, affordable, flexible early years education. Our childcare system shouldn't be something that is bearing down as another pressure on the cost of living for families. It should be something that is underpinning and oiling the wheels of our economy and family life for communities everywhere across the country. At the heart of our plan needs to be recognition and support for the early years workforce. And I know the pressures that all of you as providers are facing at the moment with recruitment and retention of staff. Early years workers are educators. It takes skill, really high levels of skill, and also vocation to do the best work with very young children. And it is amongst the most important work that happens in any setting anywhere across the country. As parents, we literally entrust the most precious people in our lives to you every single day to do the best by them and to make sure that they are equipped for school and for later life. So that's our commitment, that we will place the early years sector as a core priority of the next Labour government. We have some plans. We recognise the urgency in the system right now, and we have some plans to step up immediately the level of investment into early years. And we will work with you on a way to reform the system to ensure that providers can sustain their provision and that really high quality early years education and childcare is delivered across the country in every community that we.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. We'll move straight on, always some time for questions later on, but to the next speaker, who is going to be Dr. Julian Grenier, who's the head of Sheringham Nursery School. I think I saw on the screen. Yes. Fabulous. Julian, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I had a different running order, so if I appeared slightly shocked then, I apologise. Am I able to share my screen?
Yeah.
We'll share slides for you, Julie, give us a second to.
Lovely, thank you. So first of all, just to say a very big thank you for inviting me to take part this afternoon. I'm Julian Grenier, head teacher of Sheringham Nursery School here in Newham, East London, where we also run East London Research School, which is funded by the Education Endowment Foundation. And I'm just going to try and skip across a few points in these 5 minutes. So if we could move on to my next slide, please. So the EPI tell us that throughout the whole of the previous version, the Early Years Foundation stage, up to 2019, which is the last year for which we've got data because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the EPI point out that every single year, the gap between disadvantaged children and all children by the end of the EYFS was 4.6 months. So even though you can see that outcomes improve overall, that gap remains. So it's fair to say that in the period 2013 to 2019, as a sector, we made no progress at all in terms of improving equality on that key measure. And I'm sure that everyone in the room is very much aware that that situation is likely to be a great deal worse as a result of COVID-19, where we know that poorer families were hit harder. The well-being, health and development of poorer children was hit harder. On the next slide, just a few more telling statistics really from the EPI. We can see that there are serious inequalities when we look at children from different ethnic minority backgrounds. We've really failed Gypsy Roma children and Traveller of Irish Heritage children for many years in our system. I think that gap in outcomes for Black Caribbean children is something that should really concern us and pupils from Pakistan backgrounds too. So we can see significant equality issues. The EPI also tell us that children with SEND are 10 to 15 months behind other children by the end of the EYFS. So we're talking about 5-year-olds. So for a child aged 5 to be that far behind other children, I think is something that should worry us a great deal. I know that children who have SEND are going to struggle more with their learning, but we can do much, much better for this group of children. And on the next slide, let's just think about what happens next. So we sometimes have the hopeful theory that the children are young in the EYFS and they've got the whole of their schooling ahead of them. But in fact, although of course at individual child level, there's a lot of diversity, the gap on average doubles by the end of primary and doubles again by the end of secondary schooling. So that 4.6 month gap by the end of early years doubles to over 9 months and doubles again to over 18 months. So the impact of inequality in the early years then ripples through the whole of our school system in a way that affects children and young people's life chances in serious ways. And on the next slide, the Daily Mirror, for example, reported on Results Day last year how much less likely it was for a young person who's been eligible to free school meals to get the top grades in GCSEs compared to their classmates. And we know that whilst GCSE outcomes aren't the be-all and end-all, they certainly are a gateway to wider or narrower opportunities later in life for those young people. So the impact of inequality intensifies as our children and young people go through the school system. But just so that we don't cast a kind of completely gloomy cloud over all of this, we also know that we can flip this situation. So if you can move on to my next slide, please. We know that where we do well for children in the early years, that can give them the foundational skills that they need to do well in their schooling. But the reality is that many disadvantaged children leave early years and start school without the good foundational skills they need in emotional and cognitive self-regulation, speech and language development, listening and attention. And as a result of that, those children are much less able to benefit from the teaching that they will get in Key Stage 1 and beyond, a phenomenon that's known as the Matthew effect, whereby those that already have strong foundational skills do really well, and this is American data, by the way, whereas those without lag along. And that almost certainly explains why the gap widens as our children move through the school system. Look at those children at the bottom that started kindergarten without those foundation skills, went through first, second, third grade, fell further and further behind the other children. So on to the final slide. Let's just think about a world in which children did have those foundational skills. So the APPG report tells us that high quality early education and care benefits all children. And I deliberately put investing there. I don't think we should be seeing early years as a cost. We should be seeing it as an investment. Not only does it benefit all children, it has particular benefits for disadvantaged children. It reduces the risk of children developing learning difficulties. How are we going to get to this place? Let's just think about a few key themes. First of all, it's really clear that our early years sector, notably the PVI sector, is grimly and desperately underfunded and fragile. And despite the huge efforts made by practitioners on the ground, that interferes with their ability to achieve that high quality level. Secondly, training and qualification opportunities. The framework we have at the moment isn't adequate. It's not fit for the 21st century. It isn't giving us those young entrants to the profession that we need, who can make a difference to children's life chances. And thirdly, the third and final point I'd like to make is that the best evidence and research is not yet as well understood in the earliest sector as it is, for example, in the rest of the school sector. So we have a big job to do to invest in that high quality, ongoing professional development so that all of our passionate and committed teams of practitioners in the PVI, as well as in the maintained sector, can drive that quality improvement that all of our children need, but especially our most disadvantaged children.
Thank you very much indeed, Julian. That was very useful. I think particularly goes to the points which were made, touched on by me, but by Helen, about the impact that this has. Let's move on now to our next speaker, who is Dr. Nathan Archer, who I've seen on the screen as well. Dr. Nathan Archer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks very much to everyone for the opportunity to contribute to the meeting today. As you said, my name is Nathan Archer. I'm a researcher based at the International Montessori Institute at Leeds Beckett University. I've been working in the sector for 20-something years now in a variety of roles. But I wanted to use the short time available today to share something of an overview of the early childhood education and care landscape in England. I'm mindful that many in the meeting today will be familiar with this, but I think there are also colleagues attending who are not as immersed in some of this detail. So I think it's valuable to revisit the diversity of the sector and to reflect on how it's made up of many different kinds of settings providing care and education. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So there were, according to the most recent DFE provider survey, 62,000 providers with at least one child aged birth to 4 registered in England in spring 2021. And these providers were offering over 1.5 million Ofsted registered early years places. But unlike the relative uniformity of the school system, the early years system in England is made up of subsectors of providers. So the publicly funded entitlements that colleagues will be familiar with are offered by a diverse range of settings, and those include local authorities, schools, charities, social enterprises, limited companies, and self-employed childminders as well. And these settings are broadly divided into the maintained sector, which is our nursery schools and nursery classes, and the private and voluntary and independent sector, which includes day nurseries, preschools, and childminders. So on this diagram here, taken from the provider survey, you can see on the left-hand side, the proportion of the numbers of providers in England. So the dark block at the top on the left-hand side shows group-based providers. 34% of providers are group-based, and that's further divided into private and voluntary sector. 15% of providers are school-based, and 50% are childminders. But if we move to the right-hand side of the diagram, you can see a different makeup in terms of the number of childcare places that are offered. So we can see that 65% of those places are offered by group-based provision, 23% in schools, and 12% of them are childminding places. Okay, if we can move to the next slide, please. So I wanted to hone in and convey some of the details about the breakdown of these providers and how they're delivering the publicly funded entitlements. So this slide shows the total number of children registered to receive the 2-year funding. Now, this total number has been declining quite significantly in recent years, and I think it's important to note that now just 2/3 of children who are eligible for the 2-year-old funding are actually accessing this in provision, and that's further declined on the back of the pandemic as well. So those who do access it predominantly do so in the private and voluntary sector, although a substantial proportion are also attending maintained nursery schools and the nursery classes in maintained schools as well. Okay, if we can move to the next slide, please. So this is a slightly more complicated picture for 3- and 4-year-olds, which I'll try and decipher. I've highlighted the 2 funded entitlements for 3- and 4-year-olds that you can see in the right-hand columns. The furthest right, the funded entitlement, refers to the universal 15 hours that all 3- and 4-year-olds are entitled to. And the second in from the right, the extended entitlement, is the additional 15 hours, which make up the 30 hours that the children of working parents are eligible for. So in yellow, you can see that's data relating to 3-year-olds, and that I've highlighted in green is pertaining to 4-year-olds. So we can see from the total number of 3-year-olds accessing their 15 hours, 61% of those children are attending private and voluntary sector provision, and 72% are accessing their extended entitlement, or the 30 hours, also in private and voluntary provision. But there's a shift when it comes to 4-year-olds. So we can see around, that should be 76%, so apologies, rather than 84%. 76% are accessing their 15 hours in maintained provision, and 4% of them, their extended entitlement of 30 hours in maintained provision. So an interesting, but perhaps not altogether surprising shift in where we see 3- and 4-year-old taking up those entitlements. We should also add that in England, a child's access to this provision is determined by a number of factors, and that includes the availability, the close proximity to parents' home or work, the capacity of the settings that a parent chooses, but also affordability as well, where parents might choose to purchase additional hours. So a complex number of factors there influencing where these children access their funded hours. So what I've tried to convey in those few slides is that not only the diversity of the sector, but also the role that they have in meeting the needs of children and families in delivering those government funded hours as well as paid for hours. But I think it's also important to underscore the point that Julian alluded to, that this is also a fragile and a chronically underfunded sector. So that's a very quick overview of the current picture, and I hope that that sets the scene for the speakers that follow, who I know are going to talk about their experiences of working in different types of early years settings. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed to Dr. Nathan Archer. We're now going to hear from Rebecca Swindells from Foundation Stage 4, who is in the room.
I'm in the room.
Even better.
I'm actually here.
Rebecca.
Thank you. Thank you. So our early years sector is absolutely unique. In no other education sector are there such a wide range of provider types and delivery models. As Nathan has just explained, the government's funded childcare policies absolutely depend on this sector to get it right. By getting things right, we not only enable parents to return to work, but also give children a secure educational start that research confirms will last them throughout their school careers and beyond. Now, this APPG session seeks to recognise and celebrate the wide range of provisions from this sector that are supporting families and their children. We're not all large corporate chains. Many of us have set up our own businesses, starting small and growing to meet increased demand. We are an eclectic mix of extraordinary people with a passion for education, a desire to improve the life chances of the children in our care, the families in our community, and the staff that rely on us for their employment and their career fulfilment. Now, for those of you on the Zoom call, so that you can be recognised and celebrated, it would be helpful if you could put the type of provision you represent or the types of provisions you support if you're an advisor into the chat box now. We want to hear, are you a childminder? Are you a charity-run preschool? Are you a day nursery? Are you a forest school, perhaps a beach school? We'd like to be able to show the parliamentarians here today just how wide-ranging this sector is. Second slide, please. It feels that all too often people imagine early years as looking like a traditional nursery school, for which of course there is room in our early years community. However, it is important that we demonstrate that we are not all the same. Saying that, one way that we are all the same is that we are all highly qualified, we are all highly skilled professionals who deserve to be recognised accordingly. Both the DfE and Ofsted consistently praise the sector and say that we should be proud that 96% of providers are either good or outstanding. The requirements to achieve these judgments are quite rightly challenging, and the expectation that providers are knowledgeable, passionate, vigorous, and rigorous in their pursuit of excellence is appropriate. However, we are a sector under threat, with many providers on the brink of closure, while some have already shut their doors for good. We cannot provide support for families and children if we are closed. To give the parliamentarians present a flavour of our sector, I'm going to introduce you to my nursery, and then my colleague Doreen here will tell you about her career as an early years educator. So Blue Door Nursery, like most day nurseries, is open 51 weeks of the year, from 7:30 in the morning to 6:30 at night. We provide care and education to 129 children each week, up to 65 attending at a time. We provide flexibility and support for 120 local families, enabling them to work in our local town or nearby in Brighton, Lewes or Eastbourne. We are an important local employer, employing 26 staff in a range of roles. During the COVID lockdowns, we opened for longer hours and across bank holidays to support key workers. From our single nursery, we supported nurses, anaesthetists, GPs, senior detectives, police officers, teachers, and local authority leaders, enabling them to work for the benefit of us all. Now, right now, at this minute, at Blue Door, there's 61 children being nurtured by 13 staff who between them have over 100 years of early years experience and expertise. And we are just one small nursery on the south coast. Thank you.
Just to highlight as well, parliamentarians present, we've had some comments in the chat in response to part of the presentation. So everyone representing maintained nursery schools, private day nursery, chair of social enterprise, childminders, so that there is really a diversity being reflected in our audience today. And just wanted to, that will make the chat transcript available after.
That's great. It's good to know. Thank you.
Very much indeed. So Blue Door looks like lots of fun.
Certainly is.
And this is just going to ask one of my parliamentary colleagues, I'm just taking over the chair the last session, so I'm going to have to head to my committee.
We could read it on our new elected vice chair, perhaps.
You have to do that.
Right.
David's expecting me to attend a parliamentary select committee session, so Lord Watson is the chair of the rest of the meeting for us.
Right.
One speaker left.
Well, thank you. One speaker left, and it's Doreen Barton of Sounique Child.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Doreen Barton, and after having twins in 2010, I decided to change career. Before childminding, I often travelled away from home and worked long and unpredictable hours. In the hope for a better work-life balance, I opened a home-based early years setting in September 2012. I called my setting Sounique Child, with a Montessori and outdoor educational forest school focus. Can you slide up?
I sent it to you.
I'm sorry, Becky, we don't have. I think we see without.
Yeah. I was going to say on screen. There was a slide with showing some colleagues and their job roles. Many of my local childminder colleagues also had successful careers, also highly educated, and who similarly made the decision for a better work-life balance to open their childminder setting following the birth of their children. So what is a childminder? What do we do? And how are we different from other settings in the early years sector? At a nursery or larger setting, designated staff are dedicated to the various responsibilities covering all aspects of running a setting. As an Ofsted registered childminder, we do everything. The buck stops with us for all aspects of our setting. We are the lead professional. We have to track changing legislation to remain compliant. We sign up and complete children's starting points, update learning journals, progress reports, and plan for children's individual development needs. We are the first aider, we are the SENCO, making referrals when required, designated safeguarding officer, working in partnership with other professionals. We are admin, we ensure policies, procedures, permissions, contracts are all up to date. Finance officer, including making sure our invoices are sent. Cleaner, chef, health and safety officer, fire warden, we're on call. I could go on. This means we work unpaid hours beyond our operating hours, regularly into our evenings, weekends, but more importantly, into our family time. Living at our place of work means it is often difficult to switch off. I now use a digital early years system to help maintain essential records, share children's progress and wow moments with parents, and saving me a lot of time on paperwork. Settings, right? No two childminder settings are the same. We each adapt our service according to the needs of our families or those who use us. Our service can be highly flexible. For example, we might provide weekend cover, overnight or shift work patterns, sometimes even offering pick up and drop off from home. Our settings can have all siblings together, regardless of their age, and often into their teens. We are out and about because we are not restricted to remaining within the setting. Trips to museums, libraries, playgroups, restaurants, cafes, places of interest, and more are all part of a normal childminder day. Prior to COVID, children at my setting enjoyed a weekly intergenerational group at a local retirement home. Many children have grandparents living away, and it provided a lovely opportunity for the two generations to spend time and complete activities together. In September 2020, I opened my preschool, Sounique Montessori, operating from the local church hall. We operate term time and school hours for children from the age of 2 years old. We also bring in specialist teachers to deliver extracurriculum activities such as forest school, sports, language, dance and music sessions. So in closing, childminders are not all women. They involve the whole family, including partners and older children. Some family members register as assistants or co-childminders, and some even go on to open their own setting. We are not unqualified, unregulated babysitters. We are minimum level 3 qualified and sometimes graduates. Whilst working, we continue to study, we attain, then sustain, Ofsted, good and outstanding. We do not have children sitting at home watching TV all day. We take children out into the community, celebrate festivals and events, and through these concrete experiences, they learn about their world. These children are school ready. Our settings support children to be school ready, confident and independent. They attend groups outside of our settings, and when home, all age groups play and learn from each other.
Thank you very much, Doreen, and I apologize for mispronouncing the name of your setting. It looked like one word. So it is so unique, as you've outlined to us. I will now open up the meeting. We have heard from a variety of speakers, and it was, I think it was instructive that the title of the meeting was, "What difference does the early years sector make?" Well, we could be here until this time next Tuesday, fully going through all of those differences. But I think we've got from our speakers a flavour of the various ways in which a very important contribution to children's early years is made. The second part of it was a levelling up opportunity. Now, you'll all be aware that the government has announced a programme of levelling up. You created a cabinet minister for levelling up, but it's not unfair to say, there's not a party political point to be saying that it's still a bit vague, it's still a bit murky, and it's still unclear what resources will be put in behind it, which of course will determine whether or not it's successful. But I think no one will do anything other than wish it well. But in terms of levelling up, there are some issues that we've heard about today that I think are particularly important. One is, of course, the start to life that is given to children from more disadvantaged families to ensure that the gap between those who arrive at school from disadvantaged backgrounds not school ready and those who do is narrowed as far as is possible and ultimately wiped out. So I'm going to open the meeting now for either questions or contributions, either to our speakers or indeed on any of the topics that we've touched on in the last half hour or so. So it's now open for anyone to either show a hand if you're with us today, or I'm sure Mike will know if there's a hand on the screen. I can't do both ways, but we have one. First. Could you just say who you are before you ask your question and make your point, please?
I'm Cheryl.
And also, sorry, if you're speaking, can you also please project forward just so we can make sure the people online can hear your questions?
Hi, I'm Cheryl Hadland. I run a group of 32 day nurseries in the South Coast. And we are woefully underfunded, but I'm not going to go on about that because I was very interested in the Shadow Minister's comments about meals for children. Because our children in the PBI sector are not entitled to any meals, no matter how poor their families. And I was wondering if there was any intention of the government or any politician to do something about helping us to provide meals for the under fives. Do you want to take a couple of
Time, yes. Yes, Emma Coleman, online, please.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, Emma.
Lovely, great. It's lovely to hear all the speakers, and I can see a lot of areas for improvement and things that need to be worked on. But my goodness, we are in an absolute crisis at the moment. The thing that breaks my heart, and I'm sure breaks everybody else's heart here, is we are losing practitioners left, right and centre. We're not getting them in, and it's all down, as well as the pressures of the work, to finance. The funding system is broken, absolutely broken. And what's going to happen if something isn't done soon is nurseries in the hundreds, if not thousands, will close, and parents, let alone being able to give their families and their children any kind of early years education, will simply not be able to access it. We really need to address this absolute problem that we've got that's been building up for years. And in my view, we're talking about funding as a whole, but in my view, the funding system is broken and it needs to be fixed. Very quickly before I go, I don't want to take up all the time. People never seem to really address another issue with the funding, and that is if your child is born at the end of December and you're friends with a child that's born at the beginning of April, you lose out on 9 months worth of funding. And if that's 30 hours, that is thousands upon thousands of pounds, extremely unfair. Plus your child has less chance of getting a good childcare space, because if you want to do it after the funding, most nurseries don't have spaces from that summer term onwards. So it's a double blow. The whole system is just broken. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Emma. Anyone else at this stage indicating? Yes, Julian Norris, please.
Yes, I agree with everything that Emma has just said wholeheartedly. And unfortunately, I was faced with a staffing crisis around 6 months ago that actually forced me to close a 100-place nursery because I couldn't staff it adequately. Staff are leaving us in droves because they can get paid a higher salary with less responsibility, less pressure. And, you know, that I think COVID gave them time to sit back and reflect and actually look to see exactly what they wanted out of their lives. And I think we have got to stop, asking people to do things out of goodwill. We can't run on that anymore. You know, we can't run on that. We can't run on the goodwill of people that do it because they love the job. We all love the job, but everyone has got bills to pay. You know, they need, that's why we don't get men in childcare. There's not enough money. It's not sustainable. It's just not sustainable. Even 2 parents working in childcare is not sustainable for a family life to pay rent, let alone a mortgage and bills and everything. That's why we don't. And, you know, I closed a 100-place nursery, 94 families on roll, because I ended up in a situation where I was top heavy with students than qualified staff. And for me, if I can't guarantee a child's safety and we can't deliver the quality that we want to deliver, then I had to close. It cost me £50,000 in rent to get out of the lease of the building. That's where we are. And I'm sorry to say that, but that is where we are. And I've been 34 years in early years, local authority, childminder, playgroups. I've worked in every part of early years, and it's never been as bad. And I'm sorry to say that. And I absolutely love the sector, but that's where we are.
Well, thank you, Julie, and thank you for your candour in outlining what is clearly a painful situation for you personally, and of course the families for whom you catered. And so thank you also for some of the start reality, and the same to Emma. I'm going to open it up. I don't know, Helen, if you want to say something on some of the points that have been raised, because before we can get the levelling up, we really have to get a firmer understanding of just what buttons have to be pushed to enable that to begin to happen. So, Helen?
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike, absolutely. So on the question of food, so I think that food in all aspects of the education system is hugely important. And we know that it affects how, whether a child is hungry or not, it has a profound influence on their ability to learn and get the most out of what's on offer during the school day. But it also plays a really important role in their education, and it also plays a really important role in setting up the habits of for the rest of life, which have a really profound impact on health as well. And I've seen some really amazing examples in the last few months as I've been visiting different settings of some really brilliant work, providing very high quality, nutritious, varied food in early year settings. But you're right, it isn't specifically funded. I think, our priority is to, we've heard from Emma and from Julie about the kind of, just how deep is the crisis at the moment. And it's terrible to hear about a place nursery that's nearly full, having to close because of the staffing crisis, because the funding model doesn't work. Our priority is on fixing the funding. I think there are some genuine complexities around the idea of extending the free school meals entitlement to a sector that is so diverse in the nature of its providers. And I'm not going to make Labour policy on the hoof, or indeed I'd be a very bad challenge minister indeed if I made spending commitments on the hoof in a meeting like this. But I think that kind of getting to a sustainable funding model that is affordable for families, but and workable for the sector, and where we don't have nurseries either having to really bear down on the quality of food that's provided during the day because it's an expense that you can't really sustain, or having to even worse than that, close altogether because you can't make it work. That's the priority. But I am thinking, one of the things, the government doesn't have any food standards for nurseries at the moment, which also seems to be a kind of gap in policy vision, and unless you've got standards and expectations, it's really hard to then look at what is the cost of that, what is actually providing against the standard, how does that fit within the funding model, all of those things. So I think the point's well made, but I'm not going to make those points.
Do either of the speakers here or any of the speakers online wish to come back on any of the points made? Sorry, Caroline.
I've also got a question from Philip Siddle in the chat as well, Chair. If I could just like that perhaps just quickly, because it was relevant actually to what Helen was saying.
Well, maybe we'll take Philip's questions first then, Caroline, if you'll allow that, and then we'll come on to Caroline.
So Philip's question was, what was the opposition's position on childcare funding, because it's described as a subsidy for the sector at the moment? Yeah. I appreciate what you just said there about not making opposition policy on the group, but that's the question.
Yeah. Well, we're doing lots of really detailed work at the moment. So we're doing quite a lot of international comparative work on what is, what is spent in the UK and how is it spent and how is it allocated. I think we have to get to a position where the sector is stable and where the funding, the funding that is allocated is not in this very, lumpy way, but provides a better entitlement that all families can access. I think we want to get to a kind of wider universality of entitlement, the way that money is spent. We want to get to a position where the affordability for parents is improved, and we know that the figures on the amount of money that is currently in the system that isn't being drawn down by families is really shocking. And there are some sort of terrible kind of adverse consequences of the way that the system's set up at the moment. So I think you're right to talk about it as a subsidy. I'm trying to have a good discipline around not referring to free places, because I think that's it's very, very clear that the cost is always being borne somewhere, and it's certainly not fully being borne by the government at the moment. So the transparency on that is also important, of kind of what it costs you to deliver those places against the expectation of the provision and against the kind of hourly rate that the government currently provides as well.
Thanks, Helen. Can we move now to Caroline El-Saman with your question or point, please?
Thank you. I guess it's a question which is connected to the staff retention and recruitment, which again for us, Little Jungle in School of Early Childhood in London, is probably our biggest issue. We've lost a huge amount of people over the last year and a half, and we are really struggling to find quality, experienced staff to join us. So I'm really interested in understanding what discussions are happening to support the workforce, to support the sector, to actually fix this pretty quickly, because as the two other ladies have spoken about, we are so incredibly fragile, bordering on a lot of us closing down or having to close down sections to meet the ratios. But it's not even sort of bodies in the room we need. It's actually people who are experienced enough to be able to support those children who are still suffering the consequences of the pandemic. We've got massive socio-emotional and linguistic challenges, and we are really, really struggling to support them. We just haven't got the experienced, qualified, manpower to be able to support them. So there's a really urgent, like yesterday urgent situation, which I know that Brexit has not made easy at all, and now the pandemic has completely intensified. So is there a plan? Are there discussions happening? Because that is the number one priority for us.
Well, on that last point, Caroline, other discussions happening. There will be discussion happening in this all-party group at our next meeting, because that is the subject. Workforce recruitment and retention is the subject of our next meeting on the 19th, I think, of October. Now that's some time away. Other discussions happening elsewhere. Well, certainly if they're not happening within government, they should be, because there are plenty of people make those views known to them in various forums. So I think the point you made is extremely important. And as I said, all I can say from this group is that we will return to it in October. But is anyone in the room? Yes, I have two contributions from within the room. Thank you.
Question in the chat as well.
Hi, Grenier from National Dialysis Association. The workforce crisis actually existed way before the pandemic. I think this is something that we've been warning the government for the past 4 years, because level 3 qualifications are dropping down, and even level 2 people are not able to recruit. So we have actually made a number of suggestions to the department in terms of looking at bridging qualifications and fast tracking people who are already graduates but may not be in the sector, because some of that work has been done in social care and the NHS quite successfully. So lots of suggestions have been made to the FE, and they say they are looking at it. But I think in the meantime, I think some of you have seen the Royal Foundation research that was published last week, and the society as a whole needs to really understand and value early years I think that's really important. So we have just started a campaign, a UK-wide campaign to promote early years and early years staff as early years educators, and most importantly, to raise the profile, how important, what a wonderful job they do in terms of early years, and most importantly, recruit more people from the other areas into the sector. But I think, there is a recruitment crisis across the whole economy, not just in early years. But what we do need to do is actually make sure whatever the plans the government is making, that there are enough people to deliver that plan. We have warned when the 30 hours policy was introduced, we said we need to make sure, work out how many different qualification levels we need to be able to deliver that policy. And I think that is actually lacking, and that what we need is a very clear workforce strategy.
Okay, yes, just behind you.
I might have a new point if that's okay. So it was interesting when Julian Grenier mentioned about the gap for children with SEND at the end of the early years. Really important. That's a large gap, and we could be doing more. And I think when we talk about levelling up, what I'd like to say to especially all the MPs who are interested in the early years, please do engage with the Green Paper consultation that's currently out on the SEND system. As we know, it's horribly overspent. But actually, research from the Early Years Alliance has shown that a lot of settings are using their own money to pay to support children with SEND. So if there is a real investment in supporting children with SEND through early intervention effectively in the early years, then actually that will support improvements in the whole system. And so I would say that this issue is very much cross-cutting, and I would really, really appeal to practitioners, to MPs, to put in their thoughts around this to the Green Paper, so that we can get more of a focus and more recognition again of the difference that the early years makes for children with SEND across their whole lifetimes.
Thank you, that's a very important point. And there's one other, I think, online question.
Yes, so this is from Lucy Stevens. What consideration has been given to shifting the funding model to a per-child funding approach? From a per-child funding model approach to a schools type approach that also invest in staff and building costs. She says this would create greater transparency around actual running costs for parents and providers, as well as affording greater stability and flexibility.
I think probably the short answer to that, without trying to sound too cynical, is not very much. But certainly the common sense of it is there. It's clear to see, and I think the point you were making in terms of supporting early years settings, schools in particularly challenging areas offer incentives, or government offers incentives to teachers to go into schools in challenging areas. If they were to offer incentives to early years settings, those are the most challenging areas for the same reasons, and for what all of us understand is money invested at this stage in a child's life pays back many times over later on. I think that would be a line worth following. But so with the point just made there, that I don't think, I've not heard of that being in terms of government thinking. It might be something as an all-party group we want to put some thought into, and at some stage perhaps undertake an inquiry that will pull together some of the points we've heard today. I'm afraid that we are now beyond our time, and I'm not going to do anything other than thank all of our speakers and all our participants, whether or not they spoke, and say that it's really valuable as a parliamentarian to make this contact with people. And if the pandemic has done one thing, it's enabled far more people to participate in all party group meetings, because looking at the screen there, I imagine a trip to London for a 1 hour meeting would not be feasible, even if you live in London, perhaps, for many, many of you. So thank you all for being there. Thank you for those of you who have been able to be here today. Just to repeat the point, that we will reconvene on the 19th of October. You will all be informed of the details near the time. But until then, I'm afraid I must close this meeting and wish you all the best of summers, and look forward to seeing as many as possible of you in the autumn. Thank you very much.